educational screenings. It's definitely something I'm going to push for. So we are beyond excited to have a chance to acknowledge this film. And we are honored to have executive producer Monica Lewinsky and director Max Joseph with us to accept this award and discuss the documentary, its origins, its goals, its impact. Thank you so much for your willingness to join us for our conversation. It is such an honor to have you, and as I've told you, we just love this film. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's really wonderful to receive this and to be a part of this panel and discussion. This is exactly the kind of thing that we hoped would happen, that we would be able, that the film would start a conversation and that we would be there to just watch it start unfolding and to see people talking more about these things, which we found, which were very important to us for different reasons. And I think that when we made the film and before we made the film, we were looking forward to something like this happening. So thank you.
I wanted to also say thank you, and I get to show off our lovely award. Max has one coming, I think. I think we're all so grateful for the team, and also acknowledging to HBO Max and Six West and our producer Allison Luchak and our editor Alex Oatsmith that this was a real labor of love from all of us, and Max really kind of said everything. But thank you so much for recognizing the impact that the film has had and also hopefully will have for years to come. Well, I guess the hope is that we get better as a society. So maybe the hope is that this becomes this is what it used to be like before we knew how to be decent to each other. So I will stop talking now about this, and I'd like to bring in from our panel to our other two participants, Taylor Dumpson and Dr. Safiya Noble. So I think for anyone who hasn't seen the film yet, Taylor Dumpson is now a lawyer working with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. And Taylor shared her story of being a hate crime survivor with us in the film and this had happened to her when she was in college. For me, what I thought was especially powerful too about her brave presence in the film was that we were also lucky enough to get to hear from Taylor's mom, Kim. And what that provided was real sort of a context and understanding to not just what happens to a target, but also how those who are around the target are impacted as well. So I'm really happy Taylor's with us. And Dr. Safiya Noble is a professor at UCLA and co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. That's a lot of eyes there. And she is also author of the incredible book, Algorithms of Oppression, which should be on everybody's bookshelf. And she did not pay me to say that. So, but we were thrilled to have her participation to help explicate and contextualize many topics that Michelle had mentioned earlier in our documentary. So I think maybe just to start that, Max, maybe you and I should just orient everyone in how we came to work together and what our goals and focus of the film, on the film.
So I guess I'll start. Monica and I kind of separately had at the same time basically wanted to make a project around these themes, and we were pursuing them in parallel, and a mutual friend, John Ronson, actually, who's in the film, who has written this amazing book called 15, no, that's our film. The book is called...
So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
And lots of shaming.
Yeah. And John put us in touch, and Monica was already kind of working on a project with the producers and with the other executive producers, and kind of pulled me in. And that's how the ball started rolling.
Well, I think, jumping back just a sec, in terms of wanting to partner with Max, I had seen a sizzle for what he was thinking about doing with his project that John had sent me. And there was something so propulsive about Max's storytelling. And it felt really important, I think, to me at least, having not only lived through certain kinds of public shaming experiences, but also through anti-bullying activism work, to understand how heavy and hard to listen to some of these stories and the pain can be. And the idea of being able to bring in all this energy and humor at times and just unbelievable creative thinking and aesthetic, I think felt really important, so that we'd be able to have this kind of a conversation in the documentary, that hoping it would spark something, rather than just being 90 minutes of like, oh God, it's all awful. Even though a lot of it that we see, I should be laughing because like Taylor's story and some of the others. But I think also too, what we sort of set out to kind of do something that was a 360-degree view of public shaming. And I think that there had been other projects and attention brought to every angle that we touched in the film, but nobody had really brought them all together. And I think that was an important next step for us to have as a society in moving this conversation forward. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so, I think, most people are familiar with, how Monica may have come to this topic, but I had been making a show, Catfish, for a number of years, which dealt in kind of the online phenomenon of deception, starting with romantic deception, but kind of, delving into a lot of mental health issues and how mental health and the internet kind of combined and created, what we're seeing now, basically. And while I was making the show, I definitely noticed the way that the internet was evolving and the meanness was rising. Not that I think it had always been there to some degree, but it seemed important to address. And it was also really important that the right person address it. And that right person wasn't necessarily me. And I think authorship is really important these days. And it was really it was important to me and I think to the project that the author, that the perspective that this was coming from was someone who really knew this issue inside and out, not just on an intellectual level, but on an experiential level. And there are really very few people as credible in this space as Monica. And it was a dream to kind of connect with her and to have her be interested in doing this because she is the right person to tell this tale. And so that was kind of the impetus behind even connecting with her in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. One of the more challenging aspects of the film for me was really being kind of confronted with the granular views of cancel culture that we were exploring. And I don't know, Max, if you felt this way as well, but it felt to me like every time we had a way to kind of, demarcate it's this, but not that, we would then be confronted with yet another example that made us kind of go back to the drawing board. And it ultimately left me realizing that I felt that cancel culture is really the wrong umbrella term, or it's become too big of an umbrella for all of the different kinds of things that we see. And there were some great quotes from various people in our films, and if someone doesn't pick up and mention them, I can too. But I want to hear thoughts from everybody, and Dr. Noble, we'll start with you, and then maybe Taylor, you can kind of chime in after, of just having been the target of this kind of behavior that people should be canceled for. What's your perspective? And also, you had a very unique perspective on canceling and how you wanted to see that meted out in a way, or not punishment, but consequences meted out. And maybe for some of the people who haven't seen the film, you can give us just kind of give us a few minutes of your, of your story. And then lastly, Max, why don't you, maybe let us know if you saw cancel culture differently coming into the film versus going out.
Right. Well, first, I just want to say that it's so important that, namely, help us put projects like this into the world. And so I really am also honored to have been a part of a project like this, because we need more analysis. We need many, many films, many, many television shows, many books, many projects, lots of art to really help us understand our humanity better. And I think this is a film that really helped nuance exactly what you said, Monica, which is that there are consequences to all kinds of behavior in our society. And some people pay a much greater price than others. And the internet has been a type of phenomenon that has, in some ways, helped us continue to nuance certain conversations, but it's also really flattened a lot of ideas. And this is one of the things that I really appreciated about this film, is that, first of all, the very notion of a phrase like cancel culture has really, just to historically contextualize, this is kind of the weaponization of marginalized people's voices, women, people of color, LGBTQIA+ communities, who have said there must be accountability for the harm that is directed at us as individuals or at our communities. There must be accountability, and using many different pathways for those types of accountabilities. And the kind of the backlash to not just taking it on the chin, not just continuing to be victimized, has been this idea of cancel culture, right? So, just locating this phrase is very important, which, again, I appreciated a film like really trying to unpack, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about shame, when we're talking about accountability, when we're talking about consequences, and then when we're flattening all of those things into the notion of something like cancel culture, which really is a way to shut us up and silence us and say that, freedom of speech at all costs should be allowed, especially when we're talking about in digital media platforms on the internet. And of course, one of the things that we try to do, I know, namely, has been really at the forefront of this in media literacy spaces and in education, is to really help us understand that there are incredible profits to be garnered from the destruction of human life on many levels, whether it's the weaponization of shame and the destruction. And Monica, we're probably peers in age. I might be a little older, but I too was a young woman when you were, having your early experiences with the internet and mass media weaponization, and the degree to which that has ruined so many people's lives who will never be known the way that you are known, right, in this world, and the way that you've been able to advocate. In fact, what we've seen is what's much more likely to happen are the kinds of things, Taylor, that you've been through, which is young people, women of color, people who may not have the resources at the ready to fight back as powerfully even as you have been able to do. And so this is one of the reasons why I think a film like this, and making more nuanced analysis, but also using that analysis to help us garner stronger and better digital civil rights, is so incredibly important in this moment, because we are living through a time where people who are victimized by internet mobs, for example, who lose their jobs, who lose their career, who lose their health and their well-being, have very, very little recourse. And it's truly, it's not just the people who attack, but it's the companies that algorithmically facilitate the attacks, because all of that engagement is incredibly profitable to them. And so to me, this is why this film is so important, because we have an opportunity to really spend a time with the structures and the systems that go far beyond name calling, and that create new kinds of culture, new kinds of economies, and that demand new kinds of laws and new kinds of protections.
Thank you so much, everybody, for allowing us to be here and to share this space. Thank you, namely for the opportunity for 15 Minutes of Shame to be recognized for this. Thank you again, Monica and Max, for the opportunity to just be involved in a film like this and to share my story in a way that will be shared with the masses and in a different platform. And so my name is Taylor Dumpson. I am the President's Fellow at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I'm currently feeding my dog snacks underneath the table. So if you hear any barking, that's what it is. And this is what, being a hate crime survivor looks like. It looks like having an emotional support dog sitting in the bathroom with you when you're giving a presentation, trying to look like you're a professional. So let's go and do a deep dive into my own experience. So when I was a junior in college back at American University in 2017, I became the first Black woman to become student government president in the university's 124-year history. It was a really, really amazing feeling, and it was a great time sort of to experience something like that. However, my first day in office, a masked individual hung bananas from Black corded nooses with the letters of my predominantly Black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, which is the same sorority that our vice president belongs to at this current time. And they also wrote Harambe date on these bananas. These were hung from bus stops and lampposts around my campus. And I always think it's very, very important to start with the May 1st physical hate crime, because by the time that it goes, it gets larger than that and it starts to expand. Folks don't always realize the impact that the online harassment doubled down on. So 3 days later, after the May 1 hate crime, a known neo-Nazi who helped to plan Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally instructed his followers to basically give me a warm welcome, give me, some words of support on their platform. And really what this was, that their style guide and their messaging plan for how they plan to create this sort of online mob, or what we called in our lawsuit, a troll storm. Which is when you galvanize a bunch of people all over the internet to cyber harass someone. So when I talked about in the trailer, what does it look like when you have one person saying a bunch of things versus having a bunch of people saying one thing? Overnight, literally, I ended up having thousands of people, hundreds of people commenting and saying racist, sexist, the intersection between the two, anti-Semitic threats, and all sorts of nasty comments and things, but inundating that all over the internet. And it wasn't as if it was just one person. Sometimes it was one person saying multiple things, but the vast majority of times it was one-off quotes here and there from folks hiding behind, hiding behind a screen, hiding behind anonymous usernames. Folks aren't always, masking their extremism now in the same way that they did with hoods. Now they're hiding behind pseudonyms, and they're hiding behind, different name tags, whether they're gamer tags on video games or whether they're on Twitter profiles. And so the way that I sort of look at that label of cancel culture, I look at it as accountability culture. I think that a lot of different folks have perspectives on how this impacts them, but when you're right in the middle of a situation, when you are not able to utilize the law to sue social media companies for their inability to stop, or their lack thereof, or their lack of effort to try and stop this kind of harassment from happening to you over and over and over, despite you raising it to their concern, then they can just turn a blind eye, and you have nowhere else to go, and you have to figure out how, and if you have the ability to access legal resources to have a nonprofit bring your case pro bono. It doesn't happen for everybody, but luckily it happened to me, and we were able to pursue litigation against some of the neo-Nazis who cyber harassed me online, but we were also able to reach a restorative justice-based settlement with one of the individuals who was cyber harassing me.
And you pioneered, Taylor. I'm going to jump in and just say that this was, I mean, this, like, if you haven't already figured out, this is an extraordinary young woman, that it was Taylor who wanted to have a restorative justice process. So, which is incredibly gracious in general, but also as a young person is, to me, pretty remarkable.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that because for me, I was looking at it like, you know, I was 21 at the time, very, very similar age to you when you were going through something like that, and I'm like, how can people, you know, if they were in my shoes, how could they live like that for the rest of their life? How could they experience that? And I don't want to live being bitter. I don't want to live being miserable. So what did I want out of it? Because for me, sending somebody to jail wasn't necessarily going to solve the situation. The individual who hung the bananas from Nooses was never identified, even though it was across from Homeland Security and Department of Justice and the FBI investigated. So it was essentially a cold case. So the only people I could have held accountable were people that were online hiding behind the screens. And so being able to actually force one of the perpetrators to meet me face to face and to have a restorative justice-based settlement where he was able to do community service and coursework around racial justice and gender-based studies, you know, was really important to me. My parents always said, you're not allowed to just say that you're sorry when you apologize to someone. One, you need to say that you apologize because words mean something, but you can't apologize if you don't know what it is that you're apologizing for. And so I think a lot of times when people hear, so he gave you an apology, then what? You know, did it change him? What does that mean? People assume that I forgave him, and what I explained was forgiveness is something that exists, but it wasn't there in that space at that time. And so that was just one step moving forward in that accountability culture. You know, you have your life to do what you're going to do with it from now on. But I just hope that this film, sort of like the apology and the lawsuit that I was able to bring, I hope it helps people think. Because much like Dr. Noble said, when, you know, white supremacists, when folks are using shaming, social media to harass and target and victimize folks disproportionately in marginalized perspectives, it's to chill our speech, it's to make us feel unsafe, it's to make sure that we don't express ourselves. And, you know, that's the absolute last thing that I wanted to happen to me. And so I share my story, and this is just one of those ways that, you know, I continue to speak out.
Thanks, Taylor. I find Taylor to be extremely inspiring as well. One of Monica, you spoke about kind of the umbrella topic, and it's funny, from the very beginning of the film, before we even shot one frame of it, we had a lot of conversations about, well, what are we actually talking about? You know, like, what do we call it? And, you know, public shaming is one way to call it, but it's way more complicated than that. What do you call this kind of collective meanness, you know? And sometimes it's deserved, sometimes it's accountability, it's everything from the internet mob getting something wrong and coming down on someone who maybe had something taken out of context. Sometimes it's coordinated political attack that is directed at someone. Sometimes it's just straight up misogyny that's decentralized, and sometimes it's orchestrated misogyny or racism. And it kind of, there's a whole spectrum of it. And, you know, it can be called online harms, which is not a great title for a film necessarily, but there is an umbrella to all this stuff, and accountability is a major theme of it. Who deserves to be held accountable and how they deserve to be held accountable, and also it's funny because we started the film wanting to talk about there are a lot of, let's say, editorials in the New York Times and the Atlantic all about cancel culture this, cancel culture that. We need to censor the web. We need to make it more free. And that's kind of where the film starts. And we wanted to make a film about it because you can kind of go a lot deeper than just an op-ed. And where we ended up was really talking about the need for cyber civil rights, right? Which is where Dr. Noble really paints a very clear picture of we're living online, and online we have very few rights to protect ourselves, and that's to protect ourselves from other people, that's to protect ourselves from systems that incentivize anger and hate, and that also lack of protection we have on the internet comes down disproportionately on different kinds of people. And without any form of protection, we are at the mercy of the collective, of the collective. And so, I don't know, we're still trying to figure out what the actual umbrella is.
You're talking about safety online and protection online, and kind of jumping around that last October we saw Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, testified to Congress on the harmful practices and privacy violations that she had witnessed at Facebook. And this was unfurling just as our film was released. And so while she didn't actually talk about our film, I wish she had, but whatever. Her testimony shined a light in a way on how Taylor's story was actually a ghost of future things to come, and why it's so important to be paying attention to stories like this. And in the film, we also saw the role that social media played in the stories of other targets, so Laura Krolchik, Matt Colvin, and Emmanuel Cafferty. So I think this might be a good place, like whoever wants to jump in on talking about social media platforms accountability. We're probably all in agreement that it needs to be a hell of a lot more, or they need to be held way more accountable. But I don't know if anyone's got thoughts that you want to go to.
Well, I'm happy to say this because I do feel like I get up every day and work on this issue. And, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about kind of the policy that governs the internet, let's say in the United States, is we have something called Section 230 of the Federal Communications Decency Act that ensures that websites are not considered publishers, and that tech companies who publish content of a variety of types are not considered publishers in the way that, let's say, other types of media are. And that means that they have no accountability, that there's no liability on the part of Facebook or Twitter or Discord or Gab or any platform on the internet. And because of that, this really means that it's like a no holds barred around what can be said and what can happen and what can traffic through all kinds of platforms on the internet. And this is one of the things people don't realize. I'm a board member to the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is a very important organization of mostly lawyers and scholars who work on Section 230 policy and also on new laws that protect people from things like non-consensual pornography or kind of revenge porn. We've gotten those laws passed on 48 of 50 states, on the books. And slowly, issue by issue in this way is how we start to exercise the ability to have civil rights or human rights or sovereign rights protections from these kinds of matters. But because of Section 230, what you have is the United States, which is basically the safe haven. It's the Switzerland, it's the Cayman Islands of horrible things on the internet, to be quite frank. A lot of people really don't realize this. And so you have people from all over the world. And of course, we've seen this in politics where we have foreign actors, let's say, from outside the United States who are able to easily traffic in different kinds of content, weaponize certain types of ideas, and engage in different kinds of propaganda campaigns around politics, around communities, around racism, sexism. They're able to do that pretty much with impunity because we don't have any protections for the public because of Section 230. So I think this is one of the things that you'll see and you'll hear in both the film and outside of the film, beyond a lot of people talking about Section 230 reform, but that is even with the reforms that need to be made there. That is still simply not enough. Many people, I think, we believe that there has to be greater kinds of accountabilities. And one of the things that often gets invoked as a way to, let's say, forestall these conversations is the First Amendment in the United States. And of course, one of the things that is so important about thinking about that First Amendment argument is that people argue that all speech is protected speech, anything goes, which of course we know is not true. I know Taylor knows this as our resident lawyer here, that all speech is not actually protected under the First Amendment. But also, the second part of the First Amendment is our right to assembly. And of course, this is a part of the First Amendment that people really don't pay attention to when it comes to the internet and the way in which people are driven not only out of certain kinds of spaces, but those things affecting their lives off the internet. And of course, this is really an incredibly detrimental and damaging dimension of how technologies are used. I will just say, lastly, that we want to always remember that the internet is not a separate immaterial space. Despite how the tech industry likes to narrate it as the cloud and something ephemeral or as a tool, it's part of our every single day experience. If you have a bank account or you don't have a bank account, if you are in education, if you have a job, if you drive a car, if you use the public infrastructure, you go down the highways and roads, you are in the digital infrastructure too. And people need to understand that those false distinctions are part of the way that the tech sector protects itself. So we need to be thinking about, in fact, how do all of these digital technologies, how are they remaking all of our lives? How does something like what happened to Taylor or any other person whose name we don't know today follow them their entire lives, preclude them from jobs, preclude them from opportunities, destroy their children's lives or their family members' lives? There's lots of ways that we can think about the very material consequences, and that goes far beyond something like protecting speech.
So just to piggyback on that, there's not much to say else beyond that, really. It's just that a lot of times folks, like you said, folks like to hide behind the First Amendment and say, the way to chill, hate speech is to just have more speech. Well, that fundamentally assumes that more speech isn't going to be more harassing speech, and that's not going to also just inundate those people who are already marginalized and chill their sense of safety and their ability to speak freely online. Unfortunately, after the cyber harassment, I did not have any form of social media except for one private account that I had kept on the maximum protections I possibly could for 3 years. And it chilled my ability to share my thoughts with the world. I like to paint, I like to write poetry, I like to just do every other thing like every other millennial. I've had a Facebook page since I was 13 years old. So to be 21 and then have to go from 21 to almost 25 with no social media was really, really hard because it changed every bit of how I navigated. It changes the fact that if I want to go and look at something or go shopping, well, I have to log in through my Google, I have to log in through my Facebook. I have to go and click all these different things, and I was losing access to the news. I wasn't getting news updates that quickly. I wasn't getting, because if you don't have Facebook, Facebook's a little slower than Twitter. Twitter is really, really fast-paced. I just made a Twitter this past year. So this is all sort of new and exciting, but also terrifying because I've had to change how I navigate in the real world, in my day-to-day life, where I go, how I travel, which mode of transportation, whether I post pictures when I'm there or after I'm gone. I have to think through all of that in a way that I would not have to if social media platforms had done their job to be able to insulate not just the folks who are speaking and harassing people with their platforms, but also the consumers that are on those platforms that are marginalized perspectives like Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, women, people of color, queer folks, trans people that are still using those same platforms that are not given that sort of deference in terms of whose speech are we prioritizing. I'm a little sick of us prioritizing extremists white supremacist alt-right speech at the expense of Black and Brown and other folks who are having to deal with the brunt of this racism and this bigotry both online and in person.
I just want to jump in because it's what you're saying reminded me that one of the things one of our EPs or executive producers had said about the show that it was your story that also terrified her the most, in terms of you could do everything right and still have something happen like this happen to you. You know, where I made mistakes, or some of the other people in the film, it were these gradations of things, and that you would have to suffer these consequences for so long. You know, grateful you have an emotional support dog, but that, you know, I think it's very hard for people to understand when you haven't been through a certain kind of situation. These sorts of big life shifts, they require so much thought and time and energy, and it's you know, so it's I think that this very human part is also why we need the platforms to be more accountable. You know, these are the far-reaching consequences. Or, you know, my therapist, who's a trauma psychiatrist, likes to say that trauma has a very long echo. You know, that the echo of trauma is very, very long. Max, I don't know if you want to jump in on this. I wanted to kind of ask you a film-specific question, or do you have something that you wanted to?
No, jump.
Okay.
Go for it.
So you had to thread a very fine needle in this, and I know because I was there every step of the way. What was the biggest challenge for you as a director?
Well, just kind of building a transition from what Taylor and Dr. Noble just said. There were a lot of questions that we wanted to answer, just content-wise, right? Like, why is this happening? What are or are not the government doing? What is the government doing about this or not? What are the social media companies doing about this or not? And why are human beings, why do we do this? Why do we gang up on people? Why do we hate? And why is the internet somehow facilitated? And so there were those questions. And then there was just, we wanted to tell a number of stories, like you said, that showed gradations or different sides of this issue. And so juggling that with kind of making an argument or making a flow of the film, and also making it both light, because there are some aspects of public shaming that are fun, and they're fun in a really messed up way. But a lot of the time, like when we see there is a kind of pleasure to shaming someone who deserves it. We kind of like lean into it, you know, when we think that someone deserves it, and why do we do that? So it's kind of getting at the psychological aspect of it, getting at the social aspect of it, and then the kind of structural and policy-making aspect of it. So yeah, so the greatest challenge of the film was kind of juggling the personal stories, the levity, and the gravity, and making it flow, and you know, without having it just explode your mind because we're going in too many different directions at once. And I think we were able to do that. But yeah, it was tough.
You did a great job. You did a great job. I don't know if we can sort of skip this. Dr. Noble and Taylor, if you guys feel like, oh no, this is kind of a silly question, I won't be offended. But I was curious if, from having, you know, either like both of you having been in the film and having been immersed in these kinds of worlds in very different ways, if when you watched it, if there was anything that really surprised you from the film, or something that you learned. You know, Dr. Noble, I know you had mentioned, we had lunch, you had mentioned that like you showed part of the film in your class. And so I don't know, does that feel like a question you guys want to answer, or?
I would love to say there have been, well, first of all, I loved the centering of people like Taylor and some of the experts, because I think that there are films that have come out about social media, about the internet, that don't, that again universalize some of the experiences rather than really helping us understand that this is like an intersectional issue where people who are traditionally powerless, or let's say not, are kind of denied power in our society, pay a greater price. So here you have a person like Taylor who is, pretty much like the model student. She's total perfection in every way. We love her, and it reminds us, like when you see Taylor, all of a sudden you can understand Katanji. It's like you can understand Anita Hill. You can understand that Black women pay a different and higher price and also have to live inside models that are ludicrously more like demanding, okay? And so I love that part about this film compared to, let's say, other films that are out here, because I think the reason we know about so many of the most harmful dimensions of the internet over the last 50 years has truly been because of the work of Black women, women of color, LGBTQIA plus peoples, the scholars, the journalists, the activists, and the victims. And so I thought it was, Max, that I when we first met, I was like skeptical, like, are you going to get it right with this? Because that point that you make between about the levity and the gravity, it's like some people pay a greater price with longer term consequences than others, or some people are a different kind of resilience is demanded, or some people have money to get them, like, just who cares, like they can move on, and others will have to work themselves out of certain types of holes that are already structural. And so to me, that's one of the things that I appreciated about this film, quite frankly, and I think it serves as a model for other filmmakers. I appreciated also, Max, that you came to this film, you'd already had this history of storytelling about the internet. And one of the things that we know is that filmmakers often don't know a lot about the subject of their film. Like, they're curious, like, oh, I'm curious, so-and-so's story, and they go wrangle a bunch of experts. They have no idea what that those experts are actually arguing with each other on different sides of a coin, because they don't really know the space very well. And so I think this film also, again, it helps us understand that part is really important too, because people have very different sense of solutions. There are some people in the film who would argue, like, we need laws to keep people off their cell phones, or to give you like only 2 hours a day on your smartphone, right? Like, that is ludicrous, and others of us have, more of an abolitionist stance, let's say, where we think there has to be high degree of accountability, like CEO level accountability for harm. And guess what? We won't see those harms if shareholders and the C-suite are responsible. So, we also see like that there are some types of technologies maybe that should be made illegal because they're just that dangerous. And I think that, this film for me, of the many films that I've seen over the past decade, is one that I feel like is sparking, like it's giving me at least a lot of places to spark off these kinds of conversations with students and others. So thanks.
I love that. The safety aspect of things is something that Kara Swisher had a lot of great things to say about that. The real challenge was that there was so much to pack in. And there wasn't a lot of time to do that. But I think that one of the themes that really emerged from the film is this theme of accountability, right? Because public shaming in some ways, not in Taylor's story, but in the others, it's we publicly shame someone, we pile on someone because we think they deserve it. We're serving some kind of justice. So there's that aspect of it. But then there's a different pillar of accountability, which is, what is the accountability of the people who are actually committing terrible things on the internet? And that's where Taylor's story really does come into play in regards to that kind of accountability. And then what kind of and how is the government accountable to protecting their citizens, and how are the social media companies accountable to protecting their users. And so it's interesting because those two levels of accountability they don't really touch, but they're both wrapped up in this issue.
I would say the thing for me that maybe, I guess, the most, I don't know what my feelings were about, like, going into the filming. I think I was a little nervous, because it was my first documentary. I'd never done one before, and I think what was difficult was that I had done a lot of different interviews. My dog decided now is the time to run through the story and stuff. But I've done a lot of different interviews, but not all of them have been me telling the story and like having to watch myself afterwards. Sometimes I'll do interviews and it's for print. Sometimes those are interviews and it's for the radio. But like doing an interview that's going to be like a movie of your like worst life experience is very, very difficult. And so Monica and I got to bond over that because we were doing some of that at the same time. So it was definitely a little weird. So I was sort of nervous, right? Because I was putting somebody else's I was putting my story in somebody else's hands to be able to tell and to be able to frame in context. And so I was really glad, for the same reasons that Dr. Noble said, like I was glad for the added voices in there. I was glad for that added context because I think the film does touch on two very important parts. It touches on cyber shaming because we think so and so deserves it, but it also touches on where does when you deserve it go left because you deserve it because you're right, you're a race I don't like. You deserve it because you're a gender that I don't like. You deserve it because of whatever else about your identity I don't like. So I think it's really, really complex. And I think that just being able to watch it and take a step back and then look at my experience inside of this broader context of what does the internet that was created 2 years after I was born and has consumed my entire life, what does that look like and how does that shape the way that we navigate all of the world? And how does that influence, when I'm sitting over here tweeting about something that happens and I don't know, like the Emmett Till case where, there's new information or a new, report about Brian Dunham's, arrest warrant, right? Like when I see that and I want to tweet about it and I'm like, okay, accountability, let's call for your arrest. It's part of that sort of cyber shaming or it's hitting on that shaming part, right? But for me, I look at that as that's that accountability aspect. And it's not for me to say, it's hard, it's tricky. But I think that's precisely, those are the kinds of scenarios and things that the documentary left me to question afterwards. Was like, where do we go? How does this fit? How do other situations fit? Or is this a whole nother story? Is this a whole nother can of worms that they're connected, but needs to get delved into? So it was definitely interesting.
I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of this amazing conversation. It really is so fascinating and another reason why I want this film in classrooms all over. I wanted to just take a moment to ask a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, if that's all right. I also wanted to share a couple of comments that came in. One is, it fills my heart to see Monica and Taylor, two women who have gone through so much public shaming, today as successful, smart, accomplished, caring people and women. Another comment, sadly, Monica was the OG in public shaming in more modern times. So sorry you went through that, Monica. You were way too young to have gone through that. And I wonder, Monica, I think that we as a society have a lot of shame in how you were treated. That I think we look at that period of time, we reflect on that period of time, and there is a lot of shame there. And I wonder, what is your response to that people are looking at your situation and feeling just so embarrassed with how we treated you?
It's challenging for me in a way that I think that I had to kind of build so many emotional structures to make it through. And so in a way I feel like I'm just very prepared to sort of just to brace for something bad, and I have to work on letting something positive come in. So and also too, I think that there's, I've gotten better at it, but when people first started to re-examine me as a person and what had happened almost 25 years ago, my therapist had said to me, I came back from something and I'm like, why don't I feel happy? Why don't I feel grateful that, I got up on stage and I gave a talk and I didn't pass out and people didn't boo me or laugh at me? That's a huge celebration. And she said it takes time with trauma. It takes time with things being different for your psyche to actually change. And so I work on those things, but I think where I feel really comfortable and happy with the shift is around that I know that means these like what happened to me will not happen to someone else to the same degree. And so I think that's where it always becomes important with these sorts of stories, like when we're lucky enough to have survived, to how do we ensure that we can protect other people or try, so I'm grateful that people see it differently. Just the short answer, sorry.
No, that was beautiful, and I really appreciated, Max, what you said at the beginning about recognizing that this story needed to be told by Monica, and I think you both did such a beautiful job in your partnership. It's just fabulous. I wanted one person's name that didn't really come up in this conversation was Loretta Ross. And I wanted to know about Loretta's, Professor Ross, I should say, has done just such incredible work and thoughtful work around calling in culture. And I wonder, Max or Monica, if you could talk about the importance kind of her role in the film.
Max, I mean, you did the interview.
Yeah, we had an amazing 3.5-hour interview with Dr. Ross, and it was amazing. It's hard to kind of paraphrase her, but I think that in a lot of ways what Taylor did in employing restorative justice and holding someone accountable without putting them in a punitive defensive stance. Basically, and that's really, and it's hard to strike this balance, and I kind of defer to Taylor here to talk about it, but I think what Loretta Ross was saying at the bottom of everything was that there is a way, with certain people, not everyone, but there is a way that if there is a way to say to someone, pause, what you just said or what you did is wrong, and this is why, without necessarily starting yet another fight or without kind of fighting fire with fire. But it's easy to say that, and it's easy for me as a white man to say that, and it's much harder for someone like Taylor, who had a onslaught of. I mean, I prefer you to talk about that kind of calling in, because I think that's what you did in a way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I look at it like calling in culture. There's the part. Calling in culture for me, it's definitely something that I was sort of grew up in college, right? It's very, very it starts very academic and then sort of merged out. But I look at my parents are educators, and for me, it was very much about how can you make something else an education moment, and not everybody is there to be educated. And so I had the opportunity once to ask Angela Davis a question at a conference or something at an assembly, and I stood up and I asked her, what do you say to people that say you're talking about too much justice? What do you say when, it feels like it's falling on people that just don't want to listen? And she was like, well, first you have to know who to expend your energy to. And that if you're going to sit there and try to explain something to someone who is deeply committed to not understanding you and to not hearing where you're coming from, to not be willing to move, that's not where you spend your energy. You spend your energy with the folks that are willing to be moved, not necessarily the folks that have all the answers, because the folks that have all the answers aren't people with open ears. You spend your time with the people that are willing to be uncomfortable. And that's sort of how I look at it. It's like, are you willing to meet me halfway? If so, then I might be able to call you in. But if you're not paying attention, then you might get a call out. But it's not a one-size model for everybody. And it's one of the things that when people ask, what would you tell other people who have this happen? It's like, I was definitely angry. There were definitely times where I was mad, but I was over here tunnel policing myself because I knew society was going to see me as an angry Black woman if I didn't handle this properly, if I didn't do something right. And so I don't think there's one way to do it. And I think that sometimes we put the onus on people of color and folks that are already in marginalized perspectives to have to educate their way out and educate their oppressors on here's how to stop being so bad. And I think that is re-traumatizing and it's absolutely exhausting. And so, like Monica, I had to get myself into a script of people start asking me questions about these things, and they want me to do that heavy lifting. What is my elevator pitch that they're pivot, so I'm not having to do that emotional labor because Google is free.
Oh, I'm gonna quote you on that, Taylor. That's a good line. Google is free.
So we are at the top of the hour, but I'd love to just get some closing remarks, if that's okay. You're talking to a group of engaged, committed educators. They are the people that are, in the classrooms with the students, really making a difference every single day and listening to what you're saying and thinking, how can I bring these conversations into my classroom and to my students? And so, not to put you on the spot, but what do you want us to know? What is the one thing you want us to be thinking about when we go back to the school, and what we should be imparting on our students? And maybe, Dr. Noble, maybe you can start, and then I'll go to Taylor, Max, and then Monica, the final word.
Sure. I think, the most important dimension of this kind of work is really helping students to cultivate a strong power analysis and to really be clear on their values. Because, again, the project here is about understanding when we should be able to powerfully name harm in our society. And I think, when I think about what this film was trying to do in naming the harm that happened to Taylor, naming the harm that happened to Monica and others in the film, that's actually not the same thing as defining the articulation of, let's say, white supremacy or misogyny or, violence on the internet toward people. People who enact that kind of behavior are not victims, they are victimizers. And that is a really important distinction that I think is people with the authority and the trust, like teachers, can really help students spend time there. Because, again, the internet really flattens our ability. It just looks at the behavior level. Well, you called somebody out. Well, you're shaming somebody because they're racist. Well, we should be ashamed of being racist. We should be ashamed of trying to raise up a white ethno-state, which is actually what's happening right now in the United States, right? We should be ashamed of rolling back Roe v. Wade and taking women's rights away. We should reflect upon that. And that's not the same thing as, again, whipping up violence against a Black woman. So, I just think those kinds of nuances are really important. And, namely as have been, I feel like, you've done so much important work around kind of this critical media literacy. And I would just say that people should really lean hard on that, on those readings, on the literature, on the research, and really understand how to teach that. Because, quite frankly, we are living in a moment where democracy is completely under threat right now. We may not be able to, in fact, roll back many of the harms that are already, the rollbacks of civil rights that are happening on a daily basis in the United States. And we are absolutely reliant upon educators to educate the public and educate young people before their memory of the kind of society that we have right now is a thing of the past.
Beautifully said, Taylor. Anything to add? That's hard.
I would just say that, to continue to teach empathy and to teach critical thinking. And I think that those are two things that we're missing a little bit of right now as well. It's in having a sea of misinformation and disinformation, not knowing how to read facts or how to look at things and see day from night, night from day, not being able to see nuance and not being able to separate things into like, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. I think just being able to make sure that like young people are able to find and build empathy between each other, folks that look like them and folks that don't. I think education is like, not that it's necessarily, it doesn't solve everything, but I think it's definitely going to put us in a better position because those who know better do better, and I just refuse to just operate in a space of, people beyond help. And so where we have the opportunity to, impart, wisdom into folks that are still willing to be molded at whatever age that is, whatever spaces we find ourselves. So if that's your classrooms, if it's your dining room table, if it's your Thanksgivings, if you're out at brunch, wherever those conversations happen, just to lean into that discomfort, because I think that's where we're going to start to get a lot more progress just across the board.
Max, final words.
Really, really hard.
Monica, there's a lot of pressure on you. I'm sorry.
No, I think that, and Dr. Noble can really speak about this way better than I can, and I would go out and get her book and look at this, but I would teach that the business of content, right? That there are structures that are dictating in a way what is happening, and these are it's not just behavior from individuals, right? There is a superstructure here. There is the New York Times, Twitter, the National Enquirer, all of these publishers and media content providers are now on the same shelf, right? Which means that they have to compete with one another for our attention. And it used to be way more cordoned off, and there were magazines and there were newspapers and there were movies, and they all kind of connected to different parts of your life. They are now all on your phone, right? And they're all they're all competing with one another to get your attention. And so when you see an article with a headline that is throwing a guy under the bus who hoarded 17,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, and he just seems like such a monster, and you're just reading, you're like, keep in mind that headline, it got you to click on it. And what other headlines got you to click on them? And why do you click? Why do you participate in this behavior? How are they? So it's really the thing I would try to impart is that trying to see the structure behind the headlines, behind the clicks, seeing clickbait for what it is, and even with the New York Times, reading it with a critical eye and saying I don't know, they're making this so black and white that I don't know if I can believe that. And there might be more to the story, so I'm gonna at least reserve judgment until I learn a little more in some different ways.
Max, you might have to add media literacy educator to your title. That's I might be reaching out for your ambassadorship to Namely.
I'm just parroting Dr. Noble.
Yes.
So.
Okay, Monica, final word.
Everyone said everything, I could sing it, but, I think we're probably tacking off of what Taylor was saying. I think that really empathy. I think teaching, I'll go the real soft route. So, when we think about how change happens, change can be, you pull a tree up from its root and you get rid of that problem. The other way it can happen is you are slowly shaving off all of the trees in the forest, and you start to get change that way too. And so I think if we want to think about where is our role in society in trying to shave off from the forest, and I think that happens from empathy. I think that happens from all the things that everybody's just said, but in terms of the awareness of that when we're clicking on something, we are giving money, and giving the money reinforces the algorithm to send us something that is taking our attention, and hence we click. So, being aware of what it can mean on a human level when you see somebody being bashed on social media online to maybe the most you can do is not pile in, and that's actually doing something, and if you've had no, with sort of younger people, we'll talk about if it's a friend being bullied and they don't feel comfortable going up and interrupting a bullying cycle, because that's not safe for everybody, send the person a text. Help someone who is a target of these things, whether you think it's deserved or not, be seen as a person. And I think that those kinds of things are important. Stop before you tell a joke. I mean, I had to practice this a lot in the last administration, not to get too political, but if things where it's like, okay, where am I being critical of policy, and where am I just criticizing someone and trying to make fun of someone because I'm angry, and those are really important distinctions, and they feed into this world that we're all living in now, and that we all have a lot more power to help change it. Some on here are superheroes doing that, but we can all contribute, and we have to contribute. So.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you all so much for being here, for being part of this amazing conversation. For the
award.
Oh, please. And Max, I promise you're getting one.
I know. Here, Max.
You are. It's on its way. Thank you all so very much. And thanks, everyone, for staying on with a little extra time. I think it was worth every minute. Really, really appreciate all of you so much. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to just end stuff with a little bit about tomorrow. I just want to make sure everyone knows the schedule for Sunday. We have a meet and greet with our amazing board members and our journal team at 10 a.m. Eastern. Then it's followed by our final lessons from